Good morning, afternoon, or evening, folks, and welcome to Cast of All Trades, the show where we talk about developing skills, exploring ideas, and following curiosity. My name is Orion. In this episode, I talk about the skill of prioritization. What is it, why is it important, and how to develop it. Why is prioritization such an important skill to me? There are three things that come to mind. First, if we don't set our own priorities, they'll often be set for us. If we don't know which direction that we're going in or what we want to set as most important in our own lives, other people are very quick and very easy to tell us, ooh, this is what's important. You should focus on doing this thing because that serves their priorities. Second, self-evidently, what you prioritize is what you'll pursue. It seems obvious when I say it, but you would be surprised at how many people I've seen say, I want to do this thing, but they don't make it a priority. That's not really what they pursue. So you pursue the things that you actually prioritize, not just the things that you say you prioritize. So if you don't know your priorities, you're not going to be able to pursue what you really want to. And third, if you can't prioritize, you often won't do much of anything at all, or progress towards anything that you really want, because you're so busy jumping from one thing to the next that you don't spend enough time focused on just this one thing to make tangible progress towards it. So these are my three main reasons why prioritization is an important skill. But what do we get wrong about prioritization? The first and probably the biggest thing that I see most commonly done that people really get wrong about prioritization is mistaking time management for prioritizing. Yes, it can go hand in hand sometimes, but not how many people do it. And when I see people, quote unquote, time managing, they're saying, I'm going to spend X amount of time on this thing, Y amount of time on the next thing, and so forth. They lay out this very clean, neat schedule, but then they don't actually follow it. They create this perfect world, I will do XYZ things, and it's great in a perfect world, but you're never going to live in a perfect world. So that all that time you spent time managing is really just you putting off doing the thing that's actually important. But moving that aside, what are some other things that people get wrong about prioritization and prioritizing things in their lives? Misprioritization is quite common, and there's two ways that this can come up. There's actions versus words and false versus true productivity. A good example of this is, let's go to the actions versus words. Say you want to become an author, you want to write a book. That is what you really, really want in your life. A common way that you can misprioritize things is you tell everyone that you're going to go be an author, then you don't spend any time writing, but you feel good because you're telling people you're working on this book, you have this awesome idea in your head, but you never put pencil to page. That's a common misprioritization where we feel like we're making progress towards something, but we're not actually making progress towards it. Action versus words and false versus true productivity. True productivity would be sitting down for 20 minutes a day working on your manuscript versus false productivity being, I'm going to go and do something and think about my book for a while and feel like, I thought about my book for a while. I feel productive when you didn't actually do anything. Yes, there's times and places where perhaps thinking about your book is the right thing to do, and that is true productivity, but it's writing this fine line between what is actually pushing you towards your end goal and actually dedicating time to doing that thing. So, actions versus words and false versus true productivity. Next is urgent versus important. We often get attracted towards things that appear urgent in our lives, even if they aren't that important. For example, you get a text message and you think, oh, I have to answer this right away. I get a notification on my phone. It's this beacon of attraction in my pocket that I pull it out and suddenly, I'm lost down a rabbit hole because something looked very urgent. Something caught my attention and said, hey, pay attention to me over here, even if it's not super important. A good example of this can be found in my next what we get wrong about prioritization, and that's to-do lists. A common way that you can find that urgent versus important blending with the to-do list is having the bloated to-do list, having it bloated with so many tasks that you can't actually do it, and often doing the easy things or what we want to do first. So you might have a bunch of very small tasks to do in a day, to drop off a package at UPS, to go drop off some library books, to go pick up some groceries, go do laundry, go do a bunch of other small things. And yes, while they might be good things for you to do, They might just be urgent, or they might be like pressing on your mind. You might not have to do them right away, and they might not be the most important things that you do, but you focus on them because they're easy. You can get the satisfaction of checking things off your to-do list because, ooh, it's on the list, I can check it off, and you feel so good about yourself. Hooray, good job. But was that really what you wanted to do that day? To-do lists are a very easy way to distract ourselves from what we really want to do. It's so easy to throw a bunch of things on a to-do list to say, I'm going to do all of these things today, and maybe get 2 of them done. It's often also easy to just do what is quote-unquote easy on that to-do list, or do what we want to first, not necessarily what's most important to do first. Also, there's the feeling of doing well when you check off a bunch of things on your to-do list, even if they're not that important at all. Going back to the dropping off the library book, going and dropping off a package at UPS, going and filling out a bunch of paperwork for something that really doesn't matter all that much right now. And finally, one thing that I know that I've certainly fallen victim to with to-do lists is adding things to your to-do list after you've already done them so you can get the satisfaction of checking them off already. It's dumb, I know people who do it, I know I'm not the only one who does it. Doing this makes you feel like you've done so much more in the day, which yes, you have done a lot, but how much of that was really important to you? How much of that would you consider a number one priority that you had to get done today? Oftentimes, most of it isn't. Another issue I commonly see around prioritization is trying to overcome distractions and overcome the mental barriers and following your prioritizations. A lack of priorities makes distraction so much easier. When you don't know what you're prioritizing, it's so easy to just be caught in the wind, just go with the flow, and sometimes that's great. Sometimes that's exactly what you need to do. But most of the time, if you want to get something done, you have to decide, I have to do this thing, and you have to go out and focus on that thing. You can't have distractions popping up in your head. You can't have your phone notifications going off that draw you away from what's really important to you. And sort of going in line with that is multitasking, splitting your focus across many things at the same time. You'll make less progress across each of them compared to if you just focused on doing one thing at a time. This doesn't mean that you can't do a bunch of stuff. It just means they have to do it one thing at a time. I like to focus on a bunch of projects at the same time. In college, I often did engineering classes, I did silversmithing, I worked on my first book, and did a couple other things all at the same time. But how I did it was I focused on one thing at a time. If it was time for homework, I did the homework. If it was time for silversmithing, I did my silversmithing. It was time to work on the book, it was time to work on the book. This is great and all, talking about the problems that many of us face while trying to prioritize, or many of the problems we face in failing to prioritize. But how can we actually get better at prioritizing things? Let's go back through that list one by one and really talk about how can you focus on each of these aspects. First off, starting with urgent versus important. What is actually important to you? Most people don't spend very long in our days to sit down and just think to ourselves, what is it that I actually want to do today? What is the number one thing that I wish that I could do? In fact, you don't even have to spend every day doing this. You don't have to spend every week, maybe not even every month. Maybe you just spend like once a year sitting down and deciding for yourself, what is important to me? What do I want to get done this year? Just think about that for 20 minutes. Great. You've made more progress than a number of people have trying to figure out what are they going to work towards. But I would encourage you to think about what's important to you at least like once a month or once a week to start to figure out what am I going to do in my daily life to actually move towards what is important to me. You don't have to spend most of the time that you have on what is important, but you should have dedicated time to focus on what is important. A good example of this is going back to the example of the wannabe author. The wannabe author spends 20 minutes each morning before going to work writing their manuscript. Sure, they're probably going to spend more time at work working or working on other tasks, but they always make time for what's important to them. That's their manuscript and actually writing and becoming that author that they want to be. So just because it's important doesn't mean they have to spend the most time dedicated to that thing, but you should have time carved out to do that thing. Moving on to to-do lists and versus priority lists. I've talked about this a bit on the podcast before, but I generally don't like to-do lists. They can work sometimes, and I use them as well. But if you want to be really productive in doing something, I would recommend going and building yourself a priorities list. This goes back to the first step of what is urgent versus important. You have to decide to yourself, what is important to me? What do I want to get done? And then take what's most important and do that first. There's 2 benefits from this. One, you feel accomplished at starting the day with what you really want to do. And two, because it's at the start of the day, you often have the most mental willpower to actually do the thing. As you go throughout your day, your body gets tired, your brain gets tired. So do you think you're going to want to work on your manuscript at the end of the day when you've been tired from work, you've been looking at screens all day, and all you want to do is just go lay down, crawl into bed, and fall asleep? Probably not. It's the same thing for working out. The reason that most people who work out get up and work out first thing in the morning is because they don't want to work out after they go to work. They don't want to exercise after they spent all day at work doing stuff. They want to work out first thing in the morning when they're well rested and ready to go. They have enough mental energy to say, yes, I'm going to do this hard thing first thing in the morning, and they feel good about it. So, to-do lists versus priority lists. Build yourself a priority list. Decide what is the most important thing that I can do today, and set that thing as number one. Then if you want to keep going, what's the second most important thing? Then the third, and then the fourth. And just go down that line to say, what are the most important things that I can do this day? Or even better, if I could only do one of these things today, what would I want to get done? And put that thing as number one. Then if you have extra time, what's the second most important thing? That if I happen to get this done, like, awesome, that's amazing. Set that number two. Then keep on going down the line. Then by doing that, you'll know, I see. This is what I actually prioritize. So, to-do lists versus priority lists. Next, going back to overcoming distractions, overcoming mental barriers, and following your prioritizations. This is often simple in theory, but more difficult in practice. Let's start with putting away the distractions or adding things that get in the way of said distractions. To continue the example of the wannabe author, they want to write, but they want to type everything out. So, awesome, great. What they can do is they can have their writing set up perfectly ready for them to go first thing in the morning. So whenever they go to bed, the night before they go, they set up their writing setup. So once they wake up, they can just go over to their desk and start typing away. Awesome. The problem is maybe they like to type on a computer, which most of us do. So they'll often boot up, like, ooh, before I start typing, what if I hop onto Twitter? What if I hop onto other social media platforms? And suddenly they're distracted, and the time they had set aside to work on these things just suddenly is gone. They overcame the first step of getting to their computer because they had it pre-set up so they could just sit down and start working. Now it's time to add something to get in the way of the potential distractions that they might have. To do that, there are certain apps that can shut down certain programs on your computer for certain periods of time. Perhaps they set that up to say, okay, the only program that's going to work on my computer from 6:30 until 7 is going to be my word processor. It's going to be LibreOffice or whatever. So they hop on, they try to go to Twitter, and then they realize, wait a second, I can't. There's something in my way. I guess I'm just going to go back to writing because it's the only thing that I can do on my computer. There we go. That's a short and simple example of putting away distractions and making things easier for you to do. You don't want to have to use a bunch of willpower first thing in the morning. Honestly, I kind of think the idea of willpower is kind of dumb for most people to do most things. You don't need a bunch of willpower to go and do something super difficult. You just have to lower the bar, lower the barriers, make it easier for yourself to go and do the thing. If you want to write a book, then make it easy to do so. Make it fun. Make it so that you want to go and do it. Make it so that you don't have any other option but to go and do it, because it's the only fun thing that you have to go and do. Another way you can make some tasks easier to do or easier to get into is to consider strategic multitasking. Now, I know I just said a little bit ago that multitasking is one of the worst things you can do to really stay prioritized on doing a thing, but hear me out. For simpler tasks, multitasking can be a great thing. A good example of this is going back to our workouts. If you want to exercise more, then have a rule for yourself that you can only listen to your favorite music or your favorite podcast while you're working out, while you're doing a certain thing. It's combining a simple task with a delightful task, a difficult thing with an easy thing. By doing that, you can make it more exciting to do that difficult thing. I know a lot of people who don't like to work out, but if they're able to listen to their favorite music to it, or if they're able to watch their favorite show or listen to their favorite podcast while they're doing it, it's like, okay, this isn't as bad, and it's more fun now, and they feel better about it. So by combining things together in strategic multitasking, especially for simpler tasks such as working out, that can be a great way to make overcoming distraction a bit easier. Or I guess to correct that, instead of overcoming distraction, you're supplanting one distraction like one negative distraction for a positive distraction that you can do at the same time. Finally, on the topic of overcoming distractions and making things easier for yourself, lowering those mental barriers, the last thing I want to touch on here is that if you can, try to leave the thing in sight. If you can quickly start doing the thing that lowers your activation energy needed to follow your prioritizations. I mentioned this earlier with the make it easy for yourself and trying to be an author by setting up your station the night before you're going to go start writing. If you can leave stuff out so you can just think on it as you pass your station throughout the day, great. If you can get up, just walk to your station at any point and start writing, wonderful. That lowers the mental barrier of actually starting. The last thing I want to touch on is going back to multitasking. How can we use multitasking to our advantage for prioritization? For this, I want to look at deep work versus shallow work. And I already touched on this briefly in the last section of overcoming distraction, but for simpler tasks, I'll call these shallow work, where you're not too mentally invested into it. You don't have to be super mentally invested into working out for the most part. It's moving your body, doing some fairly repetitive movements time and time again. It's shallow work. It's pretty easy for you to multitask with. Deep work, on the other hand, requires your focus. You can't be thinking about doing a bunch of things at the same time, because otherwise, if you're going to do that, you're not going to get anything done. This is the author trying to write their book. For tasks that are really important and require focus, stop multitasking. For some people, that might even go as far as not playing music while you're trying to write your book. You have to figure out what is the mental limit that you can do to actually make progress on doing the things you want to do. To limit multitasking, it ultimately comes down to combining the other things that I've mentioned here, limiting distractions, setting your priorities, and just going down your list one by one. Follow your priority list, go down the line and do things one at a time. Yes, this will require some willpower, but you can lower the amount of willpower that you do need to follow your priorities by taking some precautions, by setting some things up ahead of time. If you get easily distracted on your phone while you're trying to write your book, set it in another room, or have there's a number of little plastic vaults that you can put your phone in for a time limit. Just put it in there, set the time limit, great. You don't have access to your phone. What are you going to do? You can set things up so you don't have to have nearly as much willpower to focus on doing the thing. With some concerted effort and some forethought, you don't have to worry about multitasking nearly as much and getting distracted nearly as much, because you can get rid of those distractions. You can get rid of the possibility of multitasking by taking some forethought and setting things up ahead of time. In summary, know your priorities. There are many ways that you can establish your priorities and actually follow through on them. Start by deciding what's important to you, add it to a priority list, and make it as easy as possible to do the thing and follow through. If you enjoyed this episode, then please share with a friend you think would like it, or share it on social media. It would absolutely mean the world to me, and it helps the podcast grow so much. With all that said, thanks for listening. I greatly appreciate it, and I'll talk to you all later. Ciao.